Hi, I'm Charity Nebbe. I'm the host of Talk of Iowa from Iowa Public Radio. And it is just wonderful to be here with you today, celebrating the 100th anniversary of public broadcasting in Iowa. And today is actually the day that WOI Radio at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, received its broadcast license. WSUI at the University of Iowa in Iowa City got their license, or its license, a couple months later in June. But we are celebrating that 100th anniversary. And I think it's important to think about how powerful and revolutionary these two radio stations were when they went on the air. And then even more so after they had established themselves and really created a community of radio listeners. AM 640, that's the signal out of Ames, WOI, AM 640 is a huge signal. It covers at its full strength, it covers the entire state of Iowa and part of the surrounding states. And of course, AM radio was all there was in the beginning of radio. And that served as a beacon to really connect rural Iowa with urban Iowa, with Iowa State University, and Iowans with each other. It really was powerful. And WSUI AM 910, that's a powerful signal as well. It's not quite as big as AM 640, but it did so much to connect with the university community and bring that intellectual knowledge to Iowans, again, really creating community. And so these two stations are the foundation that Iowa Public Radio is built upon. And things have changed a lot since things started in the 1920s. Of course, Iowa Public Radio is still here, still educating, still entertaining, still enlightening listeners, and still bringing listeners together and building this community. And before I introduce our special guest today, I do want to introduce the woman who is steering Iowa Public Radio into the future, our fearless leader, Myrna Johnson, our executive director. Welcome, Myrna.
Thank you, Charity, and welcome everyone to this exciting event celebrating the 100th anniversary of WOI and WSUI and the compelling storytelling, news and information, and music programming that leads to driveway moments daily for Iowans and for Americans across the country. Today, you will hear from one of the founding mothers of NPR, Susan Stamberg, one of NPR's rising stars, Leila Fadel, and our own incredible Charity Nebbe, as we look back and listen forward. It's been over 2 years since our last big IPR event, which was Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me in January of 2020. And to my mind, this lineup was worth the wait. 3 phenomenal women who represent the best of what public radio offers today and who highlight why the future of public radio and Iowa Public Radio is very bright. I would especially like to thank the sponsor of this event, Cultivating Compassion, the Dr. Richard Deming Foundation. The foundation support is instrumental to bringing this event to you. Thank you. And finally, thank you for joining us for this conversation. We would not exist without your support. There are over 500 of you on this call, which is very exciting for us. You're all a part of the IPR community. Thank you for helping us celebrate 100 years, and here's to 100 more.
Thank you so much, Myrna. And it is time to introduce our special guests today. And I would say that they need no introduction because that is pretty much true, but I am going to do a little bit of introducing anyway. Susan Stamberg is here. She was the first woman in the United States to anchor a nightly news program starting in 1972 when All Things Considered went on the air. She's won pretty much every major award in broadcasting. She hosted All Things Considered for a long time, Weekend Edition Sunday, and of course she is still working as a special correspondent, so we are all lucky enough to get to hear her work still, and she is with us now. Susan, welcome.
Thank you so much. You know, I was in Ames. I'm sitting here thinking about, are you WOI or are those old call letters? Yes.
Oh, we still are WOI, although we're all part of Iowa Public Radio now.
But you're 100 years old.
Yes.
Which is almost as long as I have been in public radio. But it was a wonderful time, and I had a wonderful time in Ames. Maybe talk about it later because you have to meet Leila.
Yes, now let's introduce Leila Fadel. She has been with NPR for a decade now. She's one of the newest hosts of Morning Edition and the podcast Up First. Before that, she was a national correspondent for NPR based in LA, covering race and identity. Before that, she was an international correspondent based in Cairo, covering a wave of revolts in the Middle East and their aftermath. And she has not yet won every major award in broadcasting, but she is well on her way and doing extraordinary work. Leila, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it is a joy to have both of you here. And as we're looking back and forward at the same time, let's start with some of that thinking about the beginnings of NPR, Susan. And one of the things I think we've all been celebrating the 50th anniversary last year of NPR and that wonderful special that you were a big part of. I hope everybody's heard it. And if you haven't, you should go back and listen. But one of the things that, of course, was revolutionary was that you, a woman, were put on the air in the anchor chair. And right from the very start, one of the goals of NPR has been to sound like America.
Yeah.
And your voice was a big step forward in that. I would love to hear your thoughts about how revolutionary NPR sounded, even at the start.
Yes. First of all, there were so many women on it from the very beginning. And for me, I'll tell my story because it really spreads to many, many other people. I had no role models because no woman, it wasn't just in the United States, it was anywhere in the world. No woman had, well, I'm not sure, Leila would know better about maybe in the Middle East. I doubt it. Right. And maybe Africa, I doubt it. Maybe Russia though,
Maybe.
Could have been. But anyway. And I, with no role models, I didn't know how to be. I thought I had to sound like a man. And my voice is deep now, but it was less deep when that many years ago. So I did what I thought I should do. I imitated the men. And I spoke with a very low voice, and as authoritatively as I could. And the man he was our first program manager, and he was the one who really conceived of All Things Considered. Which was our flagship program, the first program on our air. Bill Seamering was his name, and he was the one who hired me too, and said the two most valuable words in the world to me. He said, "Be yourself." And nobody says that to you except maybe Mr. Rogers. Otherwise, they say, comb your hair, sit up straight, change your dress, whatever. But he said, "Be yourself." And it was like just the most extraordinary permission because he wanted the sound. He had the sound in his head and he heard me and my style as the person he wanted to hear. He was hearing it in his head, get her out of my head and get her onto the air. And that was it. So I could relax and speak on the air just as I'm speaking to you. And it was catching. I guess everybody else was very relieved too, that they could do it. I still every now and then hear those more formal sounds, those very careful sounds. And I think we're getting less and less careful sounding. We have done that over the years, which I welcome enormously as we become more diversified too.
Well, and learning to sound like yourself is actually a lot harder than it sounds like. As somebody who's gone through that process, I even train people to go through that process, and it is hard. But it's so interesting to listen to the evolution of voices on NPR, because one of the things that attracted me as a young broadcaster to NPR and Iowa Public Radio was that people sound authentic, really like themselves. And even one of the things that I noticed early on is that it was pretty clear that the broadcasters on the air on public radio were using their real names, which was not standard with commercial broadcasting. And that, there are so many jokes.
What was Walter Cronkite's real name?
What?
How interesting. He made it. How do you make up a name like Walter?
Right. But you know
King
what I'm
George
talking
is
about. I mean,
actually
if there's so
king.
many jokes about NPR names, but it's because people use their real names, and people's names are
Right.
funny sometimes. But I remember listening to Maria Hinojosa on the air,
Yeah.
and she
Yeah.
pronounced her name as she would pronounce her name.
Yes.
And that felt really revolutionary.
Yes. Yes, it is. But and Leila,
That's the big question I always get is, how do I say your name?
Well,
how do you
tell us
pronounce
about
it?
that, Leila, because I
Yeah.
say it Fadel.
Yeah.
It sounds like you say Falden.
Yeah, so there's no N in my name, just correction. But I would like to start by saying I came into the business at a time where I got to have role models. So
Yeah.
if you think about me being the newest host, first of all, we had the first woman broadcaster in the country. But right now you've got Elsa Chang and you've got Aisha Roscoe and you've got me and Rachel Martin. And not only are we women, but we've got like this diversity of race that never existed either, on top of the plethora of reporters and correspondents on our air and producers. So it feels really lucky, at least for me, to come into the business at a time where that's the standard.
Yes.
There is an expectation that we need women on the air. And now we're speaking about other ways to sound like America, right? Whether that's our lived experiences, our economic statuses, our races, our ethnicities, our religions, our ages, all of those things. And so I
Cultures.
feel, our cultures, exactly. So I feel excited to be in the business at a time where that part is over. I just did an interview about being a woman covering war. And I was like, we've been doing this forever. Because, in Iraq, I would say a good half, if not the majority of people I knew and looked up to that did this type of work were women. And so that for me is really different and exciting that, Susan, first of all, it's exciting to be on a panel with Susan Stamberg, but also, but it's exciting that ceiling is broken and we can break different ones now. And we can
it took decades. It took decades.
And there's still struggling.
Women going to war. There were a handful with us. Andy Garrett.
There were like 3.
A long time.
Yeah. But in Iraq, you think of Marie Colvin, who unfortunately has passed away, Liz Sly, Hannah Alem, me, Lula Garcia Navarro, Soraya Sarhadi Nelson. Like there are so many, but also there are still struggles. It's not like now it's great for women all the time and everything's perfect, but it's really different.
Yeah.
And I think that we have seen NPR lead some of that change, because I do see it changing in media in other places as well, which is really exciting. And we also see people recruiting some of our talent as well.
Yeah, they are plucking them away. Eh?
Right. Yeah. Which can hurt at times, but I don't think necessarily that's a bad thing either. But we can talk more about that in a little while. But Leila, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because, I introduced Susan by saying she was the first woman. I suspect you have some firsts to your name as well, given that you are an Arab American and part of this huge show.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty cool to be. I mean, I didn't ever think on a flagship news program at NPR, a person with my name or my faith or my culture or my identity would be a host. And so that's really exciting for me, because I did get
into your smarts. If you'd
am I smart?
Person of your smarts,
well, that's the thing.
Like that.
I mean, that's the thing is for a long time, the qualifications could be there and that was not the sound they wanted. Right. And so it's pretty exciting. But my name, it's really funny. Everybody asks about it, but it was a very particular choice that I made, actually, because when my dad came to this country, our name is Fadel. It's with a the sound, which is almost like a DH sound. And it's an Arabic letter. And we anglicized it, especially my mother did. So they would call themselves Fidel so that people would say it easier. And when I was signing off on my very first story on NPR, I thought, I shouldn't change my name for the country. I should say it right. I should say it properly. I wasn't thinking about like the long-term implications of this choice. I was just thinking, I bet my dad would like to hear his name that way, you know? And so I did that. And now everybody's like, how do you say your name? Everybody says your name. And it's like, well, I did it for me. And I did it also because a note that I often get from other people who are Arab or have this type of letter, they feel seen or they feel heard when they hear that being said. And so they'll send me a note being like, my heart soars every time you say your last name because I recognize it and I hear it. And I love that. And none of that was going through my head. All I thought was I should probably say it properly in my first story on NPR because I had been in print journalism all that time. And so that's kind of the story of my name.
What did your father say?
He loved it. He loved it. He thought it was great. And I think he really appreciated that we said it properly, you know, but then everybody was confused because you're like, have we been saying your last name wrong all this time to my family? And they're like, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
But I do have that question because, you know, it's a sign of respect to learn to say somebody's name properly. Would you rather have the rest of us learn to say your name like you do?
You know what? I don't feel that way. I feel it is a sign of respect to try to say somebody's name properly, but I'm saying a letter that exists in another language, and we do speak English here. And so I'm saying my name properly, that's my name. But if somebody tries and says it close, that's good. You know, I just got back from Ukraine in which things were not natural for me in the way that towns were pronounced and so I tried my best, but I'm sure I messed a lot of things up. So I don't feel that way, but I do feel like if we can say a person's name correctly, we should, but I'm not going to hold it against somebody for trying and not being able to say the sound of a letter in a language they're not familiar with.
Leila, what drew you to public radio?
I love how intimate audio is and how intimate storytelling is on the radio. It does something that neither the television or print can do. So you can take the time that you sometimes have in print. So you can do a 7 to 8, even 11-minute story on one of our programs, but people get to be heard how they are, who they are, right? They get to be heard even in a different language. You can hear joy and rage and excitement and all of those things. And print doesn't do that, right? You have to write that into something. And television, I find images are distracting. And frankly, you don't get time to actually tell the long story unless you get a documentary, right? And so I think that, and also the mission that this is public service, that what we do is keep people accountable, reflect the country, and do a service for listeners. And that's what drew me to it: accountability and storytelling, frankly, where you can connect with other human beings.
I want to ask you about some of the international work that you have done. And that was one of the things that drew me as a listener to public radio, because, I mean, Susan, you can testify to this. Back when I first started listening, you couldn't find international news in other broadcast outlets. I mean, it was a footnote if it was there at all. And Susan, that was a commitment that NPR really made early on.
With, at the beginning, 5 reporters. It took, I don't know how many years it took for us to have a foreign correspondent, but somebody made a very clever deal. In those days, at the beginning, this is 1971, the Christian Science Monitor was a very strong newspaper, and they had reporters everywhere. And one of the NPR suits made a deal, had got an agreement from the Monitor that we could call their correspondents anywhere in the world and put them on the radio, which was such a gift since we didn't have the resources to have our own. And that's what we did. Oh my gosh, we must have done that till late 70s, mid 70s. And our first correspondent was Robert Siegel, who became host of All Things Considered. More All Things Considered. For many years, but was a reporter, the first, and he was the first foreign correspondent. He opened the London Bureau with a lot of help from the BBC facilities and studio. And then suddenly it blossomed. I don't know the number of foreign correspondents now. Do you, Leila?
I don't know. I feel like it's like 17 to 20. I think so. Yeah.
I think so too.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
How many in Ukraine alone? And there's an interesting rotation.
Right now, yeah, the
Mhm.
Ukraine operation, the Ukraine operation is quite large, actually. We
Mhm.
have, when I was there, we had my team, and then we had 3 reporting teams on the ground. And when I say team, that could be 1 person, could be 2
Yeah.
people.
Sure.
And then I think right now we have 2 people or 3 people, and it's been rotating. So we've had correspondence from education desk and national desk and international desk, and everybody's sort of pitching in the same way we saw Iraq. That was a time where just everybody, it was all hands on deck for that conflict. But
Yeah.
Susan, how different is it when you look at NPR today, 50 years later, 5 reporters you had that time? I mean, what did you think this is what it would become?
I never felt it would be what it is today, which is a lot of people's first line of information, their only real source. Often because local news isn't much in the towns where they live.
Yeah.
But sadly, it's much because the local newspapers have also disappeared. And so there are more and more people out there who are dependent on the work that we're doing because they can't get it anywhere else. They can't get that kind of information. But I was always, from the beginning, I was very ambitious. I never thought for what the company was going to become. And we all acted that way, as if we felt this is a beginning. And sure, we're kind of clunky and we're finding our way. But we're going somewhere, and it's going to be important. So that's very satisfying to hear. And the idea of all those people is dangerous. I sent a note to, Nate Rod, who's just maybe the most recent arrival up there.
Yeah.
I adore him. I came to know him when I have been going winters to work at NPR West, mostly to keep warm, but really to see my granddaughters. But nonetheless, it's really nice to see them in the warm, get out of Washington, D.C. in winters. And so I got to know him there. And he's a guy from Missoula, Montana. And there he is in Ukraine, in towns whose names he does his best pronouncing, but you couldn't spell them. And I sent him a note. I said, "Dear Nate, everyone needs a Jewish mother. I volunteer to be yours. Capital letters. Be careful." And I got a message back. He's rigged his computer. It says, I'm not reading emails right now. Sorry. I may be in touch with you in a month or so." And I said, "I know why."
Well, Leila, could you tell us a little bit about the time that you spent in Ukraine? You are no stranger to covering international situations and conflict as well. You traveled to Ukraine, and the work that you and the rest of the Morning Edition staff and the rest of NPR has done in Ukraine has been remarkable. And the fact that you were there as a network there well before the conflict started, when a lot of other people weren't paying any attention to what was happening as the troop buildup was happening on the borders, was so incredibly powerful and valuable. But tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is true. They had not only correspondents going through, but hosts going through for about a month, maybe even 2 before the conflict began. And then the war began. So I flew to Poland, drove to the Polish border, spent about a day just reporting, or 2 days, just reporting on the sea of humanity that was just crossing the border, trying to get away, because it was so early in the war and people didn't know maybe Russia could take the entire country in a week. And so that's what they were fleeing. And then obviously there was this startling image of just women and children, because men were not allowed to leave the country in case they were called up to fight, anybody between 18 and 60. So it was just women and children getting off trains, walking across the border, people telling stories of 24 to 48 hours trying to get across or to the border, leaving their cars, people who had been displaced from Syria or Afghanistan from their own conflict, now fleeing Ukraine because Russia has invaded, which was horrible to watch. We spoke to this Afghan family who was like, and now we are here again with only the clothes on our back. And frankly, they were treated differently, not being European. And so everybody was really welcomed, but you saw these groups of people being treated relatively differently, especially in a place like Poland, which right now is being run by a government that's seen as xenophobic and towards certain communities. And we crossed into Ukraine, and it was just people trying to survive and get ready for what might be coming. So first we're in the West, which isn't being bombarded by Russian artillery. It's dealing with some strikes here and there, but they're prepping for the war and sending to the front line. So you're seeing children say goodbye to their dads, going off to fight, 19-year-old interior designers going to sign up to fight, people just ready to fight for their homeland. And people, doing whatever they could, Molotov cocktails, like this kind of thing. So we did a lot of reporting out of Lviv on displacement and preparation for war, and then went into Kyiv on an overnight train when the Russians were still right there. I mean, it was a city that sort of rumbled from the artillery, even though it wasn't right next to you. It was just this constant, and people kind of ignored it because they'd gotten so used to it. And people from Kyiv were starting to try to live again. So even though the Russians were only a couple miles away, I found hair salons open. And I remember interviewing a woman who was like, I just wanted a moment of normal in this sea of fire. And so I came to get my hair cut, and I did my nails yesterday, and I feel sick to my stomach that I did this, but it makes me feel human. And I totally got it because I've seen it in so many other places. And I was like that too. I remember in Iraq, I would find a nail salon because I was like, just want to be a person. So yeah, I mean, I think it's always really tough reporting on these stories because you are reporting on the most traumatic moments of a person's life, and hopefully traumatic moments that a lot of people will never have to live through. And there is a moral imperative to get it right and get it quickly on the air so that people are informed about what they want to do about it, whether it's public officials or civilians or citizens. And those are the moments where I'm incredibly proud to be a part of this network because of how far it reaches in this country. And also the communities that can be covered locally that are impacted by global issues as well. Because like you said, Susan, I think we're in a place now where local newspapers are dying, and people need a source of both their local, national, and international news. And so our stations are the most important thing in this landscape right now for accountability. Yeah.
Leila, weren't you just itching to get into Russia and to get real citizen reaction if they had the nerve to speak to you openly?
I mean, and the thing is in the middle of all this, Russia says, we have Charles Maines in Russia and our correspondent, and they say you can't report any bad news basically about the war. And so then he's kind of silenced for the safety of himself and his family. So you're dying to know, what do Russians think about this war? But also I was really curious about the diversity of opinion in Ukraine too, because in times of war, it is unacceptable to say certain things, even if you don't agree with them. And so everybody was united for sure behind this government and in the face of a true assault on their country. But I was also curious because there are so many deep connections between Ukraine and Russia. You were seeing a lot of families completely break apart because somebody might be pro-Russia and buying into all of this propaganda from Russia that this is denazification and all this insane stuff that was being said. And so you were seeing people not talking to their dads who were in a part of Ukraine that had been annexed, like in Crimea or part of the Donbass. So it was fascinating. And it also always worries you the longer conflict goes on, because normal rule of law and normal questioning and it all gets suspended because you need to focus on the war effort. And that's not good for society. So it's sad, it's horrible. And there's a lot of war crimes going on right now as we're talking.
The in the midst of that, of course, we know that journalists are losing their lives in Ukraine, and that must feel very vulnerable. And in the midst of this, I read on Twitter that you also came down with COVID.
Yeah. Gosh.
What was that like to be in the middle of a war zone?
With COVID?
Yeah.
Annoying, because then I had to quarantine for 5 days, so I couldn't get out there and report. I was so frustrated. But I thank God for vaccines because I got what I would consider a flu. So I was very sick for about 2 days, but I hosted, I was putting together our stories. We started gathering sort of voice memos from around the country, which included one of my favorite voices. And she wrote basically an essay, an audio essay about her family. She doesn't talk to her dad. And because she feels he's pro-Russian and okay with the fact that she might lose her life. So getting COVID was very upsetting for that reason. But I think, I've lost, this gets me a little upset, but I've lost friends in doing this type of work. And so I take what I would call a cowardly approach to reporting, because I don't think it's narratively beneficial to sit under gunfire and artillery fire. What am I learning? What am I learning by being scared right here and possibly dying? So I try to do like just away from the front line. I remember in Libya, I took a boat into a city called Misrata when Gaddafi was really killing his own people. It felt very similar to what was happening in Ukraine. No care for civilian life, firing into residential buildings. And the person firing doesn't care if they kill people that don't have weapons, if they kill children. And that's what Ukraine felt like, that the Russians didn't care. And maybe it was possible that this was the goal, right? To fully terrorize. We've heard the stories now of the rapes in Bucha outside of Kyiv and all that. So that was the intention. So I didn't want to die, because if I can't tell the story, I'm not useful. So we didn't really go very close to the suburbs when the Russians were there, but war is very random. Like there was one day where we wanted to go out with this former minister who had joined the territorial defense, and we were going to go to this mall called Retroville, which you might have heard of. It was hit in Kyiv and really destroyed. But it wasn't a constant target, and there were not Russian troops there. So we thought, okay, let's go see it and let's talk to him there. He calls and says, I can't make it today. We have an operation in Irpin, which was a suburb that the Russian forces were occupying and fighting over, and where actually a few journalists were killed in Ukraine. So we don't go. Well, that day, a Russian journalist was killed by artillery fire in that place. So even though we thought it was safe and it wasn't a repeat target, there's a randomness to conflict and a randomness really to life. Like you never know, right? So you try to make the best decisions, and NPR is really, really careful. And I really do appreciate that, because I definitely worked at a place where once I said, can I get a flak jacket? And they said, what's concerning you? And I said, the war, that's concerning. So things have really changed in that respect. I think before people, it was just kind of like, if you are willing to take the risk, go do it. And the company didn't really think about our safety, not NPR, but people's companies. But NPR really does think about that. We go in with flak jackets and helmets and advisors to help us navigate, whether we're doing something really dumb or not.
Well, we lost someone in Iraq, a photographer.
We lost a photographer in Afghanistan. Yeah, David Gilkey.
Yes.
Yeah.
We could talk about this forever, but I do want to ask Leila, again, from your perspective, you have covered the Middle East and you have covered Ukraine, and people who've been paying attention know how dire things have been in Syria, in Yemen. And of course, we know about all of these refugees leaving these war-torn countries and not having welcome, not having places to go, like we've seen with the refugees from Ukraine. And that is not to take anything away from those refugees leaving Ukraine. But you have seen this firsthand, how differently the world has responded. And maybe not the world, but the United States has responded, and the individuals in the United States. We see something, a lot of us see something in Ukraine that we couldn't relate to in Syria or Yemen.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about it a lot, because I've covered a lot of conflicts and I've covered a lot of refugee crises. And so if you think about let's talk about Poland, for example. Poland's reaction to the refugee crisis was to open its borders, which is beautiful, to watch people to be able to walk across the border and not only find a welcome, but find a meal and find a bunch of people waiting to take them somewhere safe. How incredible in the most traumatic moment of your life. But the response to Syrians and Afghans coming across the border was to call it a crisis and build a wall. And there were some people that froze to death actually on that border. Again, Syria, Afghanistan, not the border of Poland. But I do think when we cover these things as journalists, everybody deserves compassion. And loss of life and war crimes and tragedy and fighting for your homeland, that is a universal thirst. Everybody has it. And so, yes, there was a difference, I think, in the way that this was covered and responded to than other places. Obviously, that's also influenced by geopolitics. Who's our ally? Who's not our ally? You know, Iraq was a very different war. The invader was not Russia. The invader was the United States. Obviously, a very different government, a dictatorial government. But also the government did say that there was evidence that actually didn't exist in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have been saying this a lot since I came back. As journalists, we need to both question the evidence, whoever is providing it when it comes from governments, but also we need to cover this with the same urgency and compassion and humanity that we do for anywhere, because it's merited in Ukraine, but it's also merited in other places.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the one thing I will say, though, is a lot of the times you do see a lot of outpouring of sympathy at the beginning of someone's tragedy. And we're still kind of at the beginning of what's happening in Ukraine. And then people get tired. They don't want to watch it anymore. Yeah. And so we'll see how countries deal with millions of refugees in their, Poland went from having, I think it was like the 130th or 130th country in the world as a host of refugees, how many were in their country, to number 2 overnight almost.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens. And I hope this compassion and this love and this continues to support people who really do. I mean, what I saw in Ukraine was horrific, and people do need to be informed and compassionate towards it, but they need to do it it's not, I think people talked about it as being unprecedented. And I was like, wait a second, I just covered something very similar 5 years ago, but maybe, yeah. So it was definitely different. Compassion fatigue. Exactly. I saw somebody mention that. Message that.
I want to pivot a little bit and take a look forward. NPR is doing extraordinary work, and I'm so excited about the progress that NPR has made, even just in the last few years, as far as, again, really starting to sound like America. And of course, you're operating in an incredible news environment right now, and combating misinformation from many other media outlets and individuals. I mean, it's a wild time in so many ways. Let's look forward. And Susan, you can do this first. You have seen the evolution of NPR. You have seen so many things change. What is your vision for the future? What is your hope that somebody will be talking about in 10 years or 15 years or another 50?
We'll be talking about exactly the same things. We'll be talking about war and money and love and babies and the things that people talk about. And I hope we'll continue to cover that. But I think the forms in which that will be covered will change radically. I fear for the future of our news magazines and for programs per se. The big push these days is to podcasts, and that's a mixed blessing. Some of them are superb, but I feel that they narrow down the breadth of not only the numbers of an audience, because those magazines remain, the radio magazines remain in the millions of listeners, and the numbers are much smaller per podcast, although they are growing and cumulatively they're very impressive. But the thing that concerns me is that one can listen to a podcast which is only about something that interests you. And it gets narrower and narrower, the focus. It's part of sort of the me generation business, wanting to have a kind of instant gratification and hang out with things that are familiar. I miss newspapers for that, and I fear for the future of our magazine shows, because they are equivalent to the breadth of a newspaper. But I worry that I see that influencing community and maybe the divisiveness that we're feeling in the country right now, because the news consumer only consumes news that is of interest to him or her, and doesn't. I, as a newspaper reader, would always flip the page to continue on page 14, but my eye would get caught by the story on the left-hand corner. I wasn't after that one. I wanted to go over there, but I read it and I learned something else. It just added to my sense of what was happening in the world. And I don't think that happens now. And it isolates us. And television has just so withered. I mean, it doesn't get out there and give, the country came to an end at whatever time, whatever time Walter Cronkite and those people, we had 3 commercial networks. And whenever they did their news at night, the country stopped. And everybody tuned in and listened. It was like the old Roosevelt fireside chats. You gathered around and you listened, and you came away knowing something, changing your mind about something, thinking a new thought. That these days we're scattering everywhere and only focusing often on the things of interest to us, and not getting that sense of what Leila is reporting from Ukraine, or what somebody else is telling us from London, or all the other things that are happening in the world.
Yeah.
Leila, look forward for us. What do you want to hear more of? What do you hope for NPR in the future?
Yeah. I mean, I have obviously the same concerns that Susan has, because we do live in our Facebook feeds, if you will, right now. In many cases, people just are seeking out more of the familiar, as she said. But what I'm hoping is that yes, the way people listen will change, but we as a network will figure out how to not only keep our news radio show, but repackage it so that people can access it in the ways that they're familiar with. So I love that Up First exists, because maybe somebody's not going to tune into Morning Edition, but they're going to hear our top 3 hits from our show, not the top 3 things that they want to hear to confirm what they believe, but taking the incredible work that exists on NPR and figuring out how to successfully package it so that people who don't listen on the radio or don't just tell Alexa to play NPR, that they'll be able to find it, we'll be able to meet them where they are and let them catch their eyes in the modern way. So find the equivalent of turning to page 14, but doing it through their phone, right? Because I do worry, like the incredible thing about 2022 and all of these, like this past decade and a half, is that the internet has killed the gatekeeper, which is beautiful, right? Nobody gets to be the keeper of information and tell you what is important and not important. But now everybody's the gatekeeper, and some people should not be.
Right. And often they are unedited.
Unedited.
Good editors.
False information. I mean, if you think about the Rohingya massacre, for example, you can put that back to Facebook ultimately. Like, it's information that's posted on Facebook that people share with each other that has no truth to it.
Yes.
Or that ultimately, and the Arab Spring. Also, you can go back to Facebook, a totally different situation, didn't end up in a massacre. It ended up like, I can speak against my government over this man, like, for example, in Egypt, a man who was beaten to death by the police, and we know they did it. So we just have to figure out, because it's scary, the amount of misinformation and the amount of factual information you can share, and it doesn't matter to a lot of people. And we do have to figure out how to continually do our jobs as we do them, because I do think we do a stellar job at NPR, at our stations, to inform the public, but to make sure they still trust us and they know how to find us in a new way.
Good. Well said. That's good.
We gathered some questions from listeners, so we're going to take a few of those right now. And
Wonderful.
I want to start with a big question from Galen, and Leila, you can go first on this. What is the most important thing we citizens of the US can do to preserve our democracy?
I mean, to me, support independent fact-based journalism. support your member station. Like, if we are a pillar of democracy, and frankly, it is under threat. It is under threat by misinformation, by the sharing of, by the chipping away of trust, not because we're doing something untrustworthy, but because we have had public officials attack us. And I've seen it in Egypt. For example, what they would do was they would fully demonize all nonprofits and all independent media, so that when you went to shut them down and arrest all their members, obviously we're in a different country than Egypt, nobody fought for them because they had already been fully demonized. So for me, that's what we need to do. Educate yourself. I mean, in the end, journalism is about us being like, hey, we were the secretary for you at this meeting. That's really important. And here are the highlights. That's really what it is, right? Like, this school board meeting was incredibly important, and here we're going to tell you why, and you didn't have to sit through it. And now all these meetings are not being covered. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I would say vote, 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 vote. Only once each term. But
Yeah.
Do
Also,
follow the law.
and also work for campaigns and make contributions to candidates whom you respect and feel will stand for furthering your democracy. Those things. Be an active citizen.
Active citizen. I love that.
Kay says, pre-pandemic, IPR and NPR were staples in my consumption of media news. During the pandemic, during which I retired, I rely even more on public radio for balanced discourse on local, national, and international news. And she wants to know what your thoughts are on NPR as an outlet with a left of center bias, as stated by many media watchdogs. Now, I have a lot of feelings about this as well, but we do hear that a lot, that there's a liberal bias to NPR. Leila, is that part of what you were talking about, this undermining of credibility?
I mean, I don't, when I watch, for example, if you're watching an opinion show and people are talking about their opinion, fine. But what is our left of center bias? I mean, I do think it is our job to go to our public officials and say, this is not true, and you can't say it on the air. That is our job. So saying that to somebody, Republican, Democrat, whatever it is our obligation. And allowing
It's a liberal activity.
Yeah, I mean, that's the job. And so this administration, Biden is not getting an easy time on NPR right now because things are not working really well for his administration. So, but I also think let's talk about the previous administration. We were dealing with an administration that acted very differently than any administration. So for example, President Bush got a lot of heat from the media after the invasion of Iraq because WMDs were never found. And so the job is to keep that person accountable, but he interacted with the media in the rules of engagement that we had always had, right?
Yes.
With respect, answer your question. That changed. And so everybody was navigating a different dynamic where we were being called the enemy of the people for asking basic questions, but then we're expected not to be okay with that. And we just air that. And so all the rules were changing. And now they've sort of changed back, but not. And so for me, what is left of center? Left of center of who? Where does that come from? And there is an assumption that our work is going to be biased. I would say go listen to the work. Don Gagné always says to a person who says, well, NPR is just liberal media. He says, well, I did my interview with you and it will be on the air and here's when, and why don't you turn it on and see? Because I think there is a tendency for people to say the media does this. Well, we don't all do something. Not a monolith in the same way that the Middle East is not a monolith and Ukraine is not a monolith and the US is not a monolith. So that's my opinion on that.
Before we were so divided, I had an answer, and I'm sure you've done this too, Charity, in which you just package and tap whenever this issue is raised, and it's been raised since the very beginning. Are we liberal? I would say we were. We are liberal the way a liberal education is liberal. That is, there's nothing we will not discuss on the internet. We will not look at it in the most balanced way we possibly can, and there are no holds barred as far as what we will address, investigate, and report. And that's the truth too. It's the breadth of that any subject is fair game for us to be reporting, looking at, investigating.
Yes. I love that. Oh, I love that. I'm going to take that.
You can steal it. I think I
I'm
stole it from
stealing
Robert
it.
Siegel. I think I did. You know, we all sort of listened to each other and think, oh, that was a good one.
Yeah.
Well, and there's been such politicization of common decency and civil rights and things that are there's a moral code. It shouldn't be a political question. And I think that that's part of the what has happened lately with news coverage is if you are talking about these things that one group of people has politicized, then you get accused of having a liberal bias where
I mean, the other thing is I don't think every issue has both sides. We don't
I
say,
agree.
well, let's do the pros and cons of murder. What do we think? What is is racism a good thing? Like, you're never going to hear both sides of that issue. And so I don't think we go into something and say, well, the science says this, but this one study that has been debunked says that, like, we're not going to do that. That is not our job. So that's not objectivity. That is misinformation.
We've gotten better at that, and we certainly launched it and got braver at it in the Trump administration. But you had to do it every other second there, you know. And Biden, as unlike as he is, Trump still hasn't been able to erase all of that for us as a nation, certainly, but also as listeners. We don't have to say that was incorrect or that is not factual, but we examine his remarks as well, and we'll call him on it. We were much more cautious, I think, at the very beginning of Trump, much more careful, and we didn't use the words. It took quite a while for reporters to be able to say that was a lie.
I mean, there was a big debate on whether or not even to use the word lie, because you know the intent of the word lie, and do we say untruth, or like these were things we didn't necessarily,
Right, we've had to learn how to do that because we were called upon to do it from the
Deb has an excellent question. She would love to know if you feel that rural America is as well represented on NPR, as well as different races, religions, gender, and different cities.
I would say we do have an excellent reporter who covers rural America. He's going one man. I would say no. I think that in the end, ultimately, the battle that NPR continues to fight, and I think we are getting better and better about that, is to make sure we get outside of the main cities, the LA, the New York, the DC, and into communities that are not that are different racially and economically.
But we've got the WOIs, we've got stations.
But we've got stations, exactly.
And their level of expertise and excellence is really risen in my time.
I agree. And so when something is happening in an area of the country where we don't have a reporter, there is typically an excellent person on the ground who knows that community better than any of us that could fly in.
Certainly.
And they get on the air. But I do think we still need to do more of it. I think that sometimes the elections teach us that we knew less than we thought we did about what we're thinking writ large.
What public thought.
Exactly. So I agree with you. I think the stations, and we need to do a better job.
And we have a new Midwest News Bureau that's also doing great work. All of these questions could lead to 15-minute conversations. So I'm going to ask the easy one for you, Leila.
Oh, good.
Right. And we only have like 4 minutes left. How do your assignments happen? Do you volunteer to go to Ukraine, or are you told, Leila, you're going to Ukraine?
Well, it's a combination, but this time I was told, Leila, you are going to Ukraine, because the host that was supposed to go was not suddenly unavailable. And so I got 18 hours notice.
Oh.
Yeah. I was like, okay. But I think it's usually a combination. So sometimes it's like, hey, I want to go here, but then there's a war and they say, please, could you go here? You know, so it's a combination. Sometimes I say I want to do this, or an incredible producer on the show or editor on the show comes up with an amazing idea. What do you think, Susan? How does it end up for you?
Well, I'm embarrassed to tell you that I've been at it a long time. I don't get assigned things anymore. I'm self-generated. This is very good. But then,
I
but
think
I'm
you
also,
earned
and I'm
that,
sorry we
Susan.
haven't really had the chance to talk about this, because I kept thinking the arts, the arts, the arts. And, you know, that has to be a part of our mix. We have to, because it lifts people's spirits. It takes them somewhere else that's not about war and not about bad leaders and not about any of that death, destruction, but just heals your soul and makes you clearer about how you confront all the other dreadful things that you're living through. That's what I do these days. It's sort of like the meat and potatoes are the wars and those reporters. But what I get to do are the truffles and the desserts.
Well, I will say that's been for me the most fun thing about Morning Edition is one day I'm interviewing musicians and actors and novelists, and then in the next 5 minutes later, I'm talking about Egypt or Ukraine or the Midwest that's been really fun.
Well, and
Right.
you're doing a wonderful job. And Susan, I just get a thrill every time I get to hear you. And I think she's doing exactly what she wants to do right now. And she absolutely deserves that.
Oh, that's nice, but don't spread it around. They'll send me to war.
There's
Oh,
beautiful art in war. I'm just saying.
Of course, of course.
well,
I
and
just did that incredible story actually
Yeah.
about the exhibit.
yeah, there've been a couple really powerful stories about artists in Ukraine just in the last couple of weeks. So much good stuff to listen to, so much
So
incredible work
much.
being done. And I just appreciate your generosity at spending this hour with us today.
Oh,
Thank
Charity,
you
it's so nice
so
to
much.
be with you.
So nice. This was lovely. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody who joined us as well. More than 400 people joined us
Woo.
today.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty
All
awesome. I wish I could
contributors, no
tell.
doubt.
But thank you and happy birthday to WOI and WSUI
Happy
too.
birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you
Bye,
so much.
everybody.